Okay, so my research is about synthesizing nanostructures and then spray coating them onto fabric. And the purpose of this research is to replace textile dyes because dyes have harmful impacts on people and on the environment. The wastewater that is produced after the dyeing process is drained back into bodies of water, and its toxic chemicals eventually evaporate into the air, causing allergic reactions and disturbing cell functions to people working and living near textile factories. The wastewater contains around 70 toxic chemicals like sulfur and naphtha and heavy metals like lead and mercury. The wastewater clogs pores of soil, decreasing soil productivity, and it cuts away freshwater sources for millions of people. There's also evidence of low dissolved oxygen levels in bodies near textile factories, which is detrimental to marine life. An alternative to these harmful dyes is the implementation of structural coloration onto textiles. But how does structural coloration exactly work? Well, in the case of a regular object like an apple, we see the color red because when light hits the apple, wavelengths in the visible spectrum of red reflect off of its molecules and into our eyes, while all other wavelengths are. Structural coloration uses the same mechanics of reflection and absorption, but it depends solely on the shape of the object. A prime example of structural coloration is the morpho butterfly, which has nanostructures on its wings that reflect wavelengths in the blue range of the visible spectrum, giving their blue iridescent color. The nanostructures created in this research are nanospheres, and its color depends on the sizes of the nanospheres. For example, according to a study done at the University of Minnesota, nanostructures with diameters of 310, 375, and 425 nanometers appear blue, violet, green, and orange-pink, respectively. Something to avoid in my structural coloration is iridescence, so that the color hue does not change due to viewing angle. Iridescence is caused by polydispersity and long-range order of particles, which is when the particles differ in size and when there's a pattern with the arrangement of particles. To have angle-independent color, monodispersed and short-range order of particles are necessary, which is when the particles are uniform in size and when there's a tendency for particles to form small order regions that don't link together at longer distances. This combination makes the light scatter equally in all directions, and therefore there's no optimal angle to view it from. So the question of my research is, can we create structural color coatings on fabrics using sustainable methods? Other researchers have successfully spray-coated structural color coatings onto fabrics using toxic components like styrene, but I had to modify the method of synthesizing nanospheres to make it more suitable for a high school classroom. And therefore the objectives of my research can be summarized into 4 goals. First, to synthesize nanospheres that are monodispersed. Second, to synthesize different colors of nanosphere coatings by varying quantities of reactants. Third, to optimize the method of applying nanospheres onto fabric for short-range ordered particles and for the most saturated color. And finally, to discuss sustainable nanosphere alternatives for future research. The first goal was to synthesize nanospheres that are monodispersed. In this research, I synthesized nanospheres using a known method with polymethyl methacrylate, or PMMA. To create PMMA, distilled water, methyl methacrylate, or MMA, and 2,2-azobus 2-methylpropionamidine dihydrochloride initiator are stirred together for an hour under an internal temperature of 70 to 80 degrees Celsius. An inert atmosphere is maintained by pumping in wine preserver into the reaction every 10 minutes because it contains argon, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide. A successful chemical reaction is indicated by a milky white substance and by also drying drops of it onto a black surface. If successful, the PMMA will dry into a color, which is also the color that will appear when it's spray coated onto fabric. A PMMA solution was examined under a microscope and they appeared to be monodispersed under this magnification. So the second goal was to synthesize different colors of nanosphere coatings by varying quantities of reactants. In this data table, you can see the relationship between color and amount of distilled water, MMA, and the average amount of initiator used in the reaction, along with the number of successful trials. The general trend in creating color is that adding more MMA and initiator will create the left side of the visible spectrum with red, violet, and blue, and adding more water will create the right side of the visible spectrum with turquoise, green, and yellow-green. I had a total of 44 successful trials, as well as 21 failed trials until the reactions became consistently successful in creating the colors that I wanted. I was able to make a range of colors including red violet, violet blue, turquoise green, and yellow green. According to a study done at Harvard University, warmer colors such as yellow, orange, and red are more difficult to make as nanostructures tend to reflect light in the blue range of the visible spectrum more strongly. And the third goal was to optimize the method of applying nanospheres onto fabric for short-range order particles and for the most saturated color. Once the PMMA was synthesized, it was centrifuged at 9,000 RPM for 15 minutes to separate the PMMA from water. The water was then discarded, but the centrifuged PMMA was put into a 10-to-1 ratio of distilled water to PMMA, then in a 100-to-1 ratio of PMMA distilled water to carbon block. The carbon block was used to emphasize the wavelength that is being reflected more by absorbing more wavelengths. The final solution was then spray coated onto fabric for 5 layers, and each layer is equivalent of spraying a 3x3 inch piece of fabric for 5 seconds and then drying it before the next layer. I discovered that it is better to not use dry PMMA because it produces a dull color with speckles of larger particles. And dry PMMA is too much of a solid to put into a nanosphere or powdered form, and that makes it more difficult to dissolve into the spray coating solution. And I also discovered that a ratio of 1% carbon block in the spray coating solution with 5 layers of spray coating produced the most saturated color. I found this by testing its appearance using 0.5, 1, and 1.5% carbon block, along with 1, 3, 5, and 7 layers of spray coating. So the 0.5% made the color too light and 1.5 too dark, and increasing spray coating layers will increase saturation, but adding more than 5 layers can cause an accumulation of particles that gives it a rough look. However, saturation preference is also entirely dependent on the viewer, and this test shows that different hues and saturations can be produced by altering amounts of carbon black and spray coating layers. The saturation also depends on the durability of the PMMA to stay onto the fabric. We tested the durability using 3 tests. First, we soaked the spray-coated fabric into water and dried. Second, we rubbed it with a paper towel 16 times, one of which was rubbed 100 times above, as seen above. And the third test was that we simulated a miniature washing machine by putting a drop of dishwashing soap and water and then stirring the spray-coated fabric on a hot plate. Then it was stirred with just water and dried. For all 3 tests, the saturation of the PMMA was mostly maintained, indicating that PMMA has considerably high durability to stay onto cotton fabric. And the final goal was to discuss sustainable nanosphere alternatives for future research. As PMMA is a nanoplastic and nanoplastics are harmful to the environment, it cannot be used at a larger scale. It's important to note that PMMA was used as a proof of concept. We chose to synthesize PMMA because it had the most reliable method and had the most potential for success. The ultimate goal of this research is to create sustainable nanospheres. One of the alternatives includes starch acetate nanospheres, or SANs, which are biodegradable but are not as widely researched. SANs are monodisperse and have short-range order, making it the best alternative as it is difficult to find nanostructures that fit these requirements and also are in the size range to reflect light in the visible spectrum. To create starch acetate nanospheres, you stir acetic anhydride, sodium hydroxide, and pre-gelatinized starch. And I've actually attempted to create starch acetate in the setup shown above. Using what I learned from making PMMA, my future research and ultimate goal would be to synthesize SANs and spray coat them onto fabric for structural coloration. To readdress my completed goals, I first was able to create monodispersed PMMA nanoparticles and then create a range of colors including red violet, violet blue, turquoise green, and yellow green. I optimized the method of applying nanospheres onto fabric for short-range order particles and for the most saturated color, without using dry PMMA in a 1% ratio of carbon block with 5 layers of spray coating create the most vibrant color. And then finally, I discussed SANs as the best alternative for future research. Through numerous trials, field trials, hours spent in the lab, and learning from my mistakes, I was able to discover that colorizing textiles with structural coloration is possible, and I hope that my research will open new possibilities in decreasing the damages caused by synthetic dyes. But I would not have been able to do this alone. Thank you to Papa Jack, who gave me the opportunity to begin my research under his K Fellowship, to my mentor Miss Sailors for endless guidance, knowledge, and kindness, to Dr. Chan for her helpful counsel in and outside the classroom, and to my parents for their constant support and encouragement. Some advice I have for future researchers is to first know your topic so that you can avoid mistakes that could have been resolved with good preparation, and it is also important to be interested in your research topic as you will be spending much of your life in it. And finally, you should anticipate failure as it is part of the process, but make sure to not give up. Here are my references. Thank you all for listening, and I might be taking questions.